Hi, I'm Lynn Cornell, and welcome to Journey Through the Bible, a closer look at John chapter 2. All right, I want to cover just a couple of things in this chapter. Verse 1 says, "On the third day, a wedding took place in Cana of Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding as well." Now, when he says on the third day, in John chapter 1, verse 43, it says Jesus decided to leave for Galilee. So my assumption here is that the third day, because John, and it says come out of nowhere and says that on the third day. And so what does he mean by the third day? Well, he's really not clear. But I believe it's probably referring to the third day after he and his disciples had arrived in Galilee. Now, and then it says he was invited to this wedding. Now, keep in mind that Jesus grew up in Galilee. He was born in Bethlehem. And then because of the threat that was posed by King Herod at the time, Joseph, his father, they first fled to Egypt. And then when that Herod died and his brother took over, he still was sort of a brutal king. And so they didn't want to, again, settle back in Bethlehem. So they fled north to the Galilee region. Judea was in the south, and then Galilee was in the north part of Israel. So Jesus grew up around this region right here. And this is why he's no doubt familiar with the family, the father, and the couple that's getting married. So it says, "And when the wine ran out, Jesus' mother told him, 'They don't have any wine.' 'What is this concern of yours to do with me, woman?' Jesus asked. 'My hour has not yet come. Do whatever he tells you,' his mother told the servants." So this exchange between Jesus and his mother is always interesting. One, Jesus wasn't being disrespectful. We're going to see in chapter 4 where he will address another woman, the Samaritan woman, in the same way. In other words, the fact that he says woman is just a common term, how they would address. What is interesting is why Mary even approached Jesus with the request in the first place. What exactly was she expecting? And we really don't know. John didn't make it clear. So in other words, this is really kind of speculation. I think it's important to point out that by this time here, Jesus had been in ministry anywhere from 6 months to a year from the time that he was baptized. And if you notice, he has arrived in Galilee with his disciples. And so, when the writers are writing, oftentimes they're more concentrating on giving us specific information as opposed to every detail. A good example of that is that at this particular time, keep in mind, the setting here is Galilee. Well, there was a whole world that was happening other than Galilee. Well, of course, you can't cover all of that. In particularly, you had the Roman world, right? You had a Roman emperor, you had things that were going on in Rome, scandals, all kinds of things that were going on that you could actually go back and read in history. But that's not John's focus. So that's my point, is to keep in mind that as we read sometimes the narrative here, that we're getting the information that John, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, finds pertinent. So how did Mary come about that she would ask Jesus and then expect him to do something? There was remember, she had a history, by the way. At Jesus' birth, she had plenty of supernatural revelation about who Jesus was. And though there is no record that Jesus ever performed a miracle during the 30 years before his public ministry, from his public ministry, he did perform miracles. And so Mary could have been putting that together with what she already knows about her son. Verse 6, "Now 6 water jars had been set there for the Jewish purification. Each contained 20 to 30 gallons. fill the jars with water. Jesus told them, so they filled them to the brim. Then he said to them, now draw some out, take it to the chief servant, and they did. And when the chief servant tasted the water after it had become wine, he didn't know where it had come from, though the servants who drew the water knew. He called the groom and told him, everyone sets out fine wine at first. And then after people have drunk freely, the inferior, but you have kept the fine wine until now. Jesus performs his first sign in Cana of Galilee. He displayed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Now, we kind of covered this in Journey to the Bible, verse by verse. Jesus made anywhere from 120 to 180 gallons worth of wine. That would come out to something like 50 cases of wine. If you go to a liquor store and with that, figure 50 cases. In other words, Jesus turned a lot of water into wine. And by the way, I don't know what wine costs. I mean, I could have probably gave a figure here, but it probably wasn't going to be cheap either. And we know it was good wine because the chief servant complimented the groom of this wine. So, the reason why Jesus performs this miracle, however, is so that his disciples would believe in him. And that's what he says right here. He performed this sign and he displayed his glory. And if you remember in chapter 1, in verse 14, it says the word became flesh. We observed his glory, right? The glory as the one and only Son of God. But then I also said, remember, full of grace and truth. So it's important to also kind of keep that in mind. But in other words, the foundation of the disciples' faith is being laid here. They believed in him. They're observing him. They get a front row seat, as it were. They get to follow him around. Later, John would write in another epistle that we handled him, we ate with him, we touched him, we talked with him. We were there. Now, verse 12, after this, he went down to Capernaum together with his mother, his brothers, and his disciples, and they stayed there only a few days. Now, this is the only time where you see Jesus and his family together like this, which is interesting. At the beginning of the ministry of Jesus, his family is with him. Something's getting ready to happen that's going to change that. They're going to become hostile. Hostile to the point that Jesus would even say to his brothers, you're of the world, which is an indictment. It's an eternal indictment. Now, of course, his brothers would come to faith with him later on. In fact, during the period of his death and resurrection, it seems that they have come to faith, because then you also see them in the upper room in Acts chapter 2. But during this time, his brothers are very hostile. And one of the things we kind of see here is that they're devout Jews. And just like the Pharisees were devout Jews, the fact that they were devout Jews in and of itself doesn't mean that they were righteous. They were, and that's very interesting to know, because his brothers, they grew up as devout Jews. Joseph raised them that way. Every year, 3 times a year, they attended the festivals. There were 3 festivals that was required for every male to attend. 3 times a year. And we'll see Jesus attending these 3 festivals. And if you remember, even the occasion that brought about Jesus being born in a manger was Joseph bringing his then fiancée or betrothed. They traveled, even though Mary was very pregnant, 9 months pregnant, but they still made the trip, okay? And probably at any rate, I was thinking about where Joseph lived during the time before Jesus was born, and I couldn't recall it. But they made the trip, and again, it was one of the high Jewish holidays. Jerusalem was packed, and so there was nowhere to stay. And then labor came on Mary, and that's how she ended up in the manger. It wasn't because they were poor, but because it was just so crowded in Jerusalem, there was no room, and they just ended up there in the manger, that is. So they were raised Jewish. They were raised very, very devout, and they believed in the law, and to the best of their ability, they endeavored to keep the law. But they also meant they were looking for the Messiah. But when the Messiah came and manifested himself as the Messiah, because he did not, immediately usher them to the king. Even like Moses, when Moses came, Moses, led the people out of Egypt, led them out of slavery. And that wasn't Jesus' purpose for this coming. And so people were kind of let down by that. So, verse 13, the Jewish Passover is near, so Jesus went up. A trivial thing, it's going to be 3 Passovers that's going to transpire during this Gospel of John here. And this is where we get the 3.5 years of public ministry of Jesus. And so it says, in the temple complex, he found people selling oxen, sheep, and doves. He also found the money changers sitting there, and after making a whip of cords, he drove everyone out of the temple complex with their sheep and oxen. He also poured out money changers, coins, and overturned the tables. He told those who were selling the doves, "Get these things out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a marketplace." And his disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." So the Jews replied to him, "What sign of authority will you show us for doing these things?" Jesus answered, "Destroy the sanctuary, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Now, one thing that's interesting, John puts this incident of going to the temple and driving out the money changers at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. The other gospel writers put it at the end of Jesus' ministry. In fact, just within a week of Jesus' betrayal, arrest, trial, and death, burial, and resurrection. So the only conclusion is that there should be probably 2 incidents where Jesus drives out the money changers. I mean, the Pharisees had no reverence for Jesus. They had no reverence for God. And certainly as a prophet, as Jesus would be proclaiming this, they still not only rejected his counsel, they rejected him as the Messiah. So no doubt, as soon as Jesus left, they set up camp again. And so then you saw the other incident at the end of Jesus' ministry. Now, this incident, however, does get the attention of the Pharisees in a bad way. They start watching Jesus. Now they hate him. They don't see him as a preacher of righteousness. They see him as someone who has directly challenged their authority. And unlike John the Baptist, and by the way, they liked John the Baptist. John the Baptist might have been irritating to them, but they liked him. But Jesus, they're going to hate because he directly challenged their authority. He says, and by the way, he says that they're wrong. Now, when he says to them, they said, "What sign of authority?" That was a set-up question. And but this answer here, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it up in 3 days." That will be the statement that they were used to convict Jesus during his trial. Now, one other thing it says, verse 23, while he was at Jerusalem at the Passover festival, many trusted in his name when they saw the signs he was doing. One of the most interesting things here is that Jesus works signs and wonders before the people. And this is what should be done in the temple. And you kind of think all the time what has been going on in the temple under the Pharisees, under traditions. Well, really we see a lot of corruptions. The buying and selling of doves and all of that. But anyway, that's all I'm going to cover in this chapter. We'll come back some of these things are going to repeat themselves, and we'll be able to deal with them in other chapters. Okay, so we'll pick this up in chapter 3 next time. See you then.